afternoon, Joy friends. Welcome back to the Joyful House. My name is Cynthia with Cynthia's Joyful Creations, and today we are continuing to read Anne of Avonlea. So I appreciate you joining me. We'll be looking at chapter 20 called The Way It Often Happens and chapter 21, Sweet Miss Lavender. So if you will, sit back and let's enjoy these two chapters. The Way It Often Happens. Anne rose betimes the next morning and blithely greeted the fresh day, when the banners of the sunrise were shaken triumphantly across the pearly skies. Green Gables lay in a pool of sunshine, flecked with the dancing shadows of poplar and willow. Beyond the lane was Mr. Harrison's wheat field, a great wind-rippled expanse of pale gold. The world was so beautiful that Anne spent 10 blissful minutes hanging idly over the garden gate, just drinking the loveliness in. After breakfast, Marilla made ready for her journey. Dora was to go with her, having been long promised this treat. "Now, Davy, you try to be a good boy and don't bother Anne," she straightly charged him. "If you're good, I'll bring you a striped candy cane from town." For alas, Marilla had stooped to the evil habit of bribing people to be good. "I won't be bad on purpose, but supposing I'm bad accidentally?" Davy wanted to know. "You'll have to guard against accidents," admonished Marilla. "And if Mr. Shear comes today, get a nice roast and some steak. If he doesn't, you'll have to kill a fowl for dinner tomorrow." Anne nodded. "I am not going to bother cooking any dinner for just Davy and myself today," she said. "That cold ham bone will do for noon lunch, and I'll have some steak fried for you when you come home at night." "I'm going to help Mr. Harrison haul dulse this morning," announced Davy. "Haul dulse this morning," announced Davy. "He asked me to, and I guess he'll ask me to dinner, too. Mr. Harrison is an awful kind man. He's a real sociable man. I hope I'll be like him when I grow up. I mean, behave like him. I don't want to look like him. But I guess there's no danger, for Miss Lynde says I'm a very handsome child. Do you suppose it'll last, Anne?" "I want to know." "I dare say it will," said Anne gravely. "You are a handsome boy, Davy." Marilla looked volumes of disapproval. "But you must live up to it and be just as nice and gentlemanly as you look to be. And you told Minnie May Barry the other day, when you found her crying because someone said she was ugly, that if she was nice and kind and loving, people wouldn't mind her looks," said Davy discontentedly. "Seems to me you can't get out of being good in the world for some reason or other. You just have to behave." "Don't you want to be good?" asked Marilla, who had learned a great deal but had not yet learned the futility of asking such questions. "Yes, I want to be good, but not too good," said Davy cautiously. "You don't have to be very good to be a Sunday school superintendent. Mr. Bell is that, and he's a real bad man." "Indeed he's not," said Marilla indignantly. "He is. He says he is to himself," asseverated Davy. "He said it when he prayed in Sunday school last Sunday. He said he was a vile worm and miserable sinner and guilty of the blackest iniquity. What did he do that was so bad, Marilla? Did he kill anybody? Or steal the collection cents? I want to know." Fortunately, Miss Lynde came driving up the lane at that moment, and Marilla made off, feeling that she had escaped from the snare of the fowler and wishing devotedly that Mr. Bell was not quite so highly figurative in his public petitions, especially in the hearing of small boys who were always wanting to know. Anne left her alone in glory, worked with a will. The floor was swept, the beds made, the hens fed, the muslin dress was washed and hung and out on the line. Then Anne prepared for the transfer of feathers. She mounted to the garret and donned the first old dress that came to hand, a navy blue cashmere she had worn at 14. It was decidedly on the short side and as skimpy as the notable wincey Anne had worn upon the occasion of her debut at Green Gables, but at least it would not be materially injured by down and feathers. Anne completed her toilet by tying a big red and white spotted handkerchief that had belonged to Matthew over her head, and thus accorded betook herself to the kitchen chamber, whither Marilla, before her departure, had helped her carry the feather bed. A cracked mirror hung by the chamber window, and in an unlucky moment Anne looked into it. There were those 7 freckles on her nose, more rampant than ever, or so it seemed in the glare of light from the unshadowed window. "Oh, I forgot to rub that lotion on last night," she thought. "I better run down to the pantry and do it now." Anne had already suffered many things trying to remove those freckles. On one occasion, the entire skin had peeled off her nose, but the freckles, they remained. A few days previously, she had found a recipe for a freckle lotion in a magazine, and as the ingredients were within her reach, she straightway compounded it, much to the disgust of Marilla, who thought that if Providence had placed freckles on your nose, it was your bounden duty to leave them there. Anne scurried down to the pantry, which, always dim from the big willow growing close to the window, was now almost dark by reason of the shade drawn to exclude flies. Anne caught the bottle containing the lotion from the shelf and copiously anointed her nose therewith by means of a little sponge sacred to the purpose. This important duty done, she returned to her work. Anyone who has ever shifted feathers from one tick to another will not need to be told that when Anne finished, she was a sight to behold. Her dress was white with down and fluff, and her front hair, escaping from under the handkerchief, was adorned with a veritable halo of feathers. At this auspicious moment, a knock sounded on the kitchen door. "That must be Mr. Shearer," thought Anne. "I'm in a dreadful mess, but I'll have to run down as I am, for he's always in a hurry." Down flew Anne to the kitchen door. If ever a charitable floor did open to swallow up a miserable, befeathered damsel, the Green Gables porch floor should promptly have engulfed Anne at that moment. On the doorstep was standing Priscilla Grant, golden and fair in silk attire, a short, stout, gray-haired lady in a tweed suit, and another lady, tall, stately, wonderfully gowned, with a beautiful hybrid face and large blackish violet eyes, whom Anne instinctively felt, as she would have said in her earlier days, to be Miss Charlotte E. Morgan. In the dismay of the moment, one thought stood out from the confusion of Anne's mind, and she grasped at it as at the proverbial straw. All Miss Morgan's heroines were noted for rising to the occasion. No matter what their troubles were, they invariably rose to the occasion and showed their superiority over all ills of time, space, and quantity. Anne therefore felt it was her duty to rise to the occasion, and she did it so perfectly that Priscilla afterward declared she'd never admired Anne Shirley more than at that moment. No matter what her outraged feelings were, she did not show them. She greeted Priscilla and was introduced to her companions as calmly and composedly as if she had been arrayed in purple and fine linen. To be sure, it was somewhat of a shock to find that the lady she had instinctively felt to be Miss Morgan was not Miss Morgan at all, but an unknown Mrs. Pendexter, while the stout little gray-haired woman was Miss Morgan. But in the greater shock, the lesser lost its power. Anne ushered her guests to the spare room and thence into the parlor, where she left them while she hastened out to help Priscilla unharness her horse. "It's dreadful to come upon you so unexpectedly as this," apologized Priscilla, "but I did not know till last night that we were coming. Aunt Charlotte is going away Monday, and she has promised to spend today with a friend in town. But last night her friend telephoned her to not come because they were quarantined for scarlet fever. So I suggested we come here instead, for I knew you were longing to see her. We called at the White Sands Hotel and brought Miss Pendexter with us. She's a friend of Aunt's and lives in New York, and her husband is a millionaire. We can't stay very long, for Miss Pendexter has to be back at the hotel by 5 o'clock. Several times while they were putting away the horse, Anne caught Priscilla looking at her in a furtive, puzzled way. She needn't stare at me so, Anne thought a little resentfully. If she doesn't know what it is to change a feather bed, she might imagine it. When Priscilla had gone to the parlor, and before Anne could escape upstairs, Diana walked into the kitchen. Anne caught her astonished friend by the arm. "Diana Barry, who do you suppose is in that parlor at this very moment?" "Miss Charlotte E. Morgan, and a New York millionaire's wife, and here I am like this." and not a thing in the house for dinner but a cold ham bone, Diana." By the time Anne had become aware that Diana was staring at her in precisely the same bewildered fashion as Priscilla had done, it was really too much. "Oh, Diana, don't look at me so," she implored. "You, at least, must know that the neatest person in the world couldn't empty feathers from one tick into another and remain neat in the process." It, it isn't the feathers," hesitated Diana. It's your nose, Anne." "My nose? Oh, Diana, surely nothing has gone wrong with it." Anne rushed to the little looking glass over the sink. One glance revealed the fatal truth. Her nose was a brilliant scarlet. Anne sat down on the sofa, her dauntless spirit subdued at last. "What is the matter with it?" asked Diana, curiosity overcoming delicacy. "I thought I was rubbing my freckle lotion on it, but I must have used that red dye Marilla has for marking the pattern on her rugs," was the despairing response. "What shall I do?" "Wash it off," said Diana practically. "Perhaps it won't wash off. First I dye my hair, then I dye my nose. Marilla cut my hair off when I dyed it, but that remedy would hardly be practical in this case. Well, this is another punishment for vanity, and I suppose I deserve it, though there's not much comfort in that. Is it really almost enough to make one believe in ill luck, though Miss Lynde says there's no such thing because everything is foreordained?" Fortunately, the dye washed off easily, and Anne, somewhat consoled, betook herself to the east gable while Diana ran home. Presently, Anne came down again, clothed in her right mind. The muslin dress she had fondly hoped to wear was bobbing merrily about on the line outside, so she was forced to content herself with her black lawn. She had the fire on and the tea steeping when Diana returned. The latter wore her muslin, at least, and carried a covered platter in her hand. "Mother sent you this," she said, lifting the cover and displaying a nicely carved and jointed chicken to Anne's grateful eyes. The chicken was supplemented by light new bread, excellent butter and cheese, Marilla's fruit cake, and a dish of preserved plums, floating in their golden syrup as in congealed summer sunshine. This was a big bowl full of pink and white asters also, by the way of decoration, yet the spread seemed very meager besides the elaborate one formerly prepared for Miss Morgan. Anne's hungry guests, however, did not seem to think anything was lacking as they ate the simple viands with apparent enjoyment. But after the first few moments, Anne thought no more of what was or was not on her bill of fare. Mrs. Morgan's appearance might be somewhat disappointing, as even her loyal worshippers had been forced to admit to each other, but she proved to be a delightful conversationalist. She had traveled extensively and was an excellent storyteller. She had seen much of men and women and crystallized her experiences into witty little sentences and ephraim's which made her hearers feel as if they were listening to one of the people in clever books. But under all her sparkle, there was a strongly felt undercurrent of true womanly sympathy and kind-heartedness which won affection as easily as her brilliancy won admiration. Nor did she monopolize the conversation. She could draw others out as skillfully and fully as she could talk herself, and Anne and Diana found themselves chattering freely to her. Miss Pendexter said little. She merely smiled with her lovely eyes and lips and ate chicken and the fruit cake and preserves with such exquisite grace that she conveyed the impression of dining on ambrosia and honeydew. But then, as Anne said to Diana later on, anybody so divinely beautiful as Miss Pendexter didn't need to talk. It was enough for her just to look. After dinner, they all had a walk through Lover's Lane and Violet Vale and Birch Path, then back through the haunted wood to the Dryad's Bubble, where she sat down and talked for a delightful last half hour. Miss Morgan wanted to know how the haunted wood came by its name, and laughed until she cried when she heard the story and Anne's dramatic account of certain memorable walk through it at the witching hour of twilight. "It has indeed been a feast of reason and flow of soul, hasn't it?" said Anne, when her guests had gone and she and Diana were alone again. "I don't know what I enjoyed more, listening to Miss Morgan or gazing at Miss Pendexter. I believe we had a nicer time than if we'd known they were coming and been cumbered with much serving. You must stay to tea with me, Diana, and we'll talk it all over. Priscilla says Mrs. Pendexter's husband's sister is married to an English earl, And yet she took a second helping of the plum preserves, said Diana, as if the two facts were somehow incompatible. I dare say even the English Earl himself wouldn't have turned up that aristocratic nose at Marilla's plum preserves, said Anne proudly. Anne did not mention the misfortune which had befallen her nose when she related the day's history to Marilla that evening, but she took the bottle of freckled lotion and emptied it out the window. I shall never try any beautifying messes again, she said, darkly resolute. They may do for careful, deliberate people, but for anyone so hopelessly given over to making mistakes as I seem to be, it's tempting fate to meddle with them. Sweet Miss Lavender. School opened and Anne returned to her work with fewer theories but considerably more experience. She had several new pupils, 6- and 7-year-olds, just venturing round-eyed into a world of wonder. Among them were Davy and Dora. Davy sat with Milty Bolter, who had been going to school for a year and was therefore quite a man of the world. Dora had made a compact at Sunday school the previous Sunday to sit with Lily Sloane. But Lily Sloane not coming the first day, she was temporarily assigned to Mirabel Cotton, who was 10 years old and therefore, in Dora's eyes, one of the big girls. I think school is great fun, Davy told Marilla when he got home that night. You said I'd find it hard to sit still, and I did. You mostly do tell the truth. I notice, but you can wriggle your legs about under the desk, and that helps a lot. It's splendid to have so many boys to play with. I sit with Milty Bolter, and he's fine. He's longer than me, but I'm wider. It's nice to sit in the back seats, but you can't sit there till your legs grow long enough to touch the floor. Milty drawed a picture of Anne on his slate, and it was awful ugly, and I told him if he made pictures of Anne like that, I'd lick him at recess. I thought first I'd draw one of him and put horns and tail on it, but I was afraid it would hurt his feelings, and Anne says you should never hurt anyone's feelings. It seems it's dreadful to have your feelings hurt. It's better to knock a boy down than hurt his feelings if you must do something. Milty said he wasn't scared of me, but he'd just as soon call it somebody else to oblige me, so he rubbed out Anne's name and printed Barbara Shaw's under it. Milty doesn't like Barbara because she calls him a sweet little boy, and once she patted him on his head. Dora said primly that she liked school, but she was very quiet even for her. And when at twilight Marilla made her go upstairs to bed, she hesitated and began to cry. I'm frightened, she sobbed. I don't want to go upstairs alone in the dark. What notion have you got into your head now? Demanded Marilla. I'm sure you've gone to bed alone all summer and never been frightened before. Dora still continued to cry, so Anne picked her up, cuddled her sympathetically, and whispered, Tell Anne all about it, sweetheart. What are you frightened of? Of Mirabel Cotton's uncle, sobbed Dora. Mirabel Cotton told me all about her family today in school. Nearly everybody in her family has died. All her grandfathers and grandmothers and ever so many aunts and uncles. They have a habit of dying, Mirabel says. Mirabel's awful proud of having so many dead relations. And she told me what they all died of and what they said and how they looked in their coffins. And Mirabel said one of her uncles was seen walking around the house after he was buried. Her mother saw him. I don't mind the rest so much, but I can't help thinking about that uncle. Anne went upstairs with Dora and sat by her until she fell asleep. The next day, Mirabel Cotton was kept in at recess and gently but firmly given to understand that when you're so unfortunate as to possess an uncle who persisted in walking about houses after he had been decently interred, it was not in good taste to talk about that eccentric gentleman to your deskmate of tender years. Mirabel thought this was very harsh. The Cottons had not much to boast of. How was she to keep up her prestige among her schoolmates if she was forbidden to make capital out of the family ghost? September slipped by into a gold and crimson graciousness of October, and one Friday evening Diana came over. I had a letter from Ella Kimball today, Anne, and she wants us to go over to tea tomorrow afternoon to meet her cousin Irene Trent from town. But we can't get one of our horses to go, for they'll all be in use tomorrow, and your pony is lame, so I suppose we can't go. Why can't we walk? Suggested Anne. If we go straight back through the woods, we'll strike the West Grafton Road not far from the Kimball place. I was through that way last winter, and I know the road. It's no more than 4 miles, and we won't have to walk home, for Oliver Kimball will be sure to drive us. He'll be only too glad of the excuse, for he goes to see Carrie Sloane, and they say his father will hardly ever let him have a horse. It was accordingly arranged that they should walk, and the following afternoon they set out, going by way of Lover's Lane to the back of the Cuthbert farm, where they found a road leading into the heart of acres of glimmering beech and maple woods, which were all in a wondrous glow of flame and gold, lying in a great purple stillness and peace. "It's as if the year were kneeling to pray in a vast cathedral full of mellow, stained light, isn't it?" said Anne dreamily. "It doesn't seem right to hurry through it, does it? It seems irreverent, like running in a church." "We must hurry, though," said Diana, glancing at her watch. "We've left ourselves little time as it is." "Well, I'll walk fast, but don't ask me to talk," said Anne, quickening her pace. "I just want to drink in this day's loveliness, and I feel as if she were holding it out to my lips like a cup of airy wine, and I'll take a sip at every step." Perhaps it was because she was so absorbed in drinking it in that Anne took the left turning when they came to a fork in the road. She should have taken the right, but ever afterwards she counted it the most fortunate mistake of her life. They came out finally to a lonely grassy road with nothing in sight along it but ranks of spruce saplings. "Why, where are we?" exclaimed Diana in bewilderment. "This isn't the West Grafton Road." "No, it's the Baseline Road in Middle Grafton," said Anne, rather shamefacedly. "I must have taken the wrong turning at the fork. I don't know where we are exactly, but we must be all of 3 miles from Kimball still." "Then we can't get there by 5, for it's 4:30 now," said Diana, with a despairing look at her watch. "We'll arrive after they've had their tea, and they'll have all the bother of getting ours over again." "We'd better turn back and go home," suggested Anne humbly. But Diana, after consideration, vetoed this. "No, we may as well go ahead and spend the evening since we've come this far." A few yards further on the girls came to a place where the road forked again. "Which of these do we take?" asked Diana dubiously. Anne shook her head. "I don't know how, and we can't afford to make any more mistakes. Here's a gate and a lane leading right into the wood. There must be a house at the other side. Let's go down and inquire." "What a romantic old lane this is," said Diana as they walked along its twists and turns. It ran under patriarchal old firs, whose branches met above, creating a perpetual gloom in which nothing except moss could grow. On either hand were brown wood floors, crossed here and there by fallen lances of sunlight. All was very still and remote, as if the world and the cares of the world were far away. "I feel as if we were walking through an enchanted forest," said Anne in a hushed tone. "Do you suppose we'll ever find our way back to the real world again, Diana? We shall presently come to a palace with a spellbound princess in it, I think." Around the next turn they came in sight, not indeed of a palace, but of a little house almost as surprising as a palace would have been in this province of conventional wood farmhouses, all as much alike in general characteristic as if they'd grown from the same seed. Anne stopped short in rapture, and Diana exclaimed, "Oh, I know where we are now. That is the little stone house where Miss Lavender Lewis lives. Echo Lodge, she calls it, I think. I've often heard of it, but I've never seen it before. Isn't it a romantic spot?" "It's the sweetest, prettiest place I ever saw or imagined," said Anne delightedly. "It looks like a bit out of a storybook or a dream." The house was a low-eaved structure built of undressed blocks of Red Island sandstone, with a little peaked roof out of which peered 2 dormer windows, with quaint wooden hoods over them, and 2 great chimneys. The whole house was covered with a luxuriant growth of ivy, finding easy foothold on the rough stonework, and turned by autumn frost to most beautiful bronze and wine-red tints. Before the house was an oblong garden into which the lane gate where the girls were standing opened. The house bounded in on one side of the 3 others. It was enclosed by an old stone dike, so overgrown with moss and grass and ferns that it looked like a high green bank. On the right and left, the tall dark spruces spread their palm-like branches over it. But below it was a little meadow, green with clover aftermath, sloping down to the blue loop of the Grafton River. No other house or clearing was in sight. Nothing but hills and valleys covered with feathery young firs. I wonder what sort of a person Miss Lewis is, speculated Diana, as they opened the gate into the garden. They say she's very peculiar. She'll be interesting then, said Anne decidedly. Peculiar people are always that, at least, whatever else they are or are not. Didn't I tell you we would come to an enchanted palace? I knew the elves hadn't woven magic over that lane for nothing. But Miss Lavender Lewis is hardly a spellbound princess, laughed Diana. She's an old maid. She's 45 and quite gray, I've heard. Oh, that's only part of the spell, asserted Anne confidently. At heart, she's young and beautiful still, and if we only knew how to unloose the spell, she would step forth radiant and fair again. But we don't know how. It's always and only the prince who knows that, and Miss Lavender's prince hasn't come yet. Perhaps some fatal mischance has befallen him, though that's against the law of all fairy tales. I'm afraid he came long ago and went away again, said Diana. They say she used to be engaged to Stephen Irvin, Paul's father, when they were young, but they quarreled and parted. Hush, warned Anne. The door is open. The girls paused in the porch under the tendrils of ivy and knocked at the open door. There was a patter of steps inside, and a rather odd little personage presented herself. A girl of about 14, with a freckled face, a snub nose, a mouth so wide that it really did seem as if it stretched from ear to ear, and 2 long braids of fair hair tied with 2 enormous bows of blue ribbon. Is Miss Lewis at home? Asked Diana. Yes, ma'am. Come in, ma'am. This way, ma'am, and sit down, ma'am. I'll tell Miss Lavender you're here, ma'am. She's upstairs, ma'am. With this, the small handmaiden whisked out of sight, and the girls, left alone, looked about them with delighted eyes. The interior of this wonderful little house was quite as interesting as its exterior. The room had a long, low ceiling, and 2 square small pane windows contained with muslin frills. All the furnishings were old-fashioned, but so well and daintily kept that the effect was delicious. But it must be candidly admitted that the most attractive feature to the 2 healthy girls who had just tramped 4 miles through autumn air was a table set out with pale blue china and laden with delicacies, while little gold-hued ferns scattered over the cloth gave it what Anne would have termed a festal air. Miss Lavender must be expecting company to tea, she whispered. There are 6 places set, but what a funny little girl she has. She looked like a messenger from Pixieland. I suppose she could have told us the road, but I was curious to see Miss Lavender. Shh, she's coming. And with that, Miss Lavender Lewis was standing in the doorway. The girls were so surprised that they forgot good manners and simply stared. They had unconsciously been expecting to see the usual type of elderly spinster as known as their experience, but a rather angular personage with prim gray hair and spectacles. But nothing more unlike Miss Lavender could possibly be imagined. She was a little lady with snow-white hair, beautifully wavy and thick, and carefully arranged in becoming puffs and coils. Beneath it was almost a girlish face, pink-cheeked and sweet-lipped, with big, soft brown eyes and dimples. Actually, dimples. She wore a very dainty gown of cream muslin with pale-hued roses on it, a gown which would have seemed ridiculously juvenile on most women of her age, but which suited Miss Lavender so perfectly that you never thought about it at all. Charlotta the Fourth says that you wish to see me, she said in a voice that matched her appearance. We wanted to ask the right road to West Grafton, said Diana. We're invited to tea at Mr. Kimball's, but we took the wrong path coming through the woods and came out to the base line instead of the West Grafton road. Do we take the right or the left turning at your gate? The left, said Miss Lavender with a hesitating glance at her tea table. Then she exclaimed, as if in a sudden little burst of resolution, But oh, won't you stay and have tea with me? Please do. Mr. Kimball's will have tea over before you get there, and Charlotta the Fourth and I will be so glad to have you. Diana looked mute inquiry at Anne. We'd like to say, said Anne promptly, for she had made up her mind that she wanted to know more of this surprising Miss Lavender. If it won't inconvenience you, but you are expecting other guests, aren't you? Miss Lavender looked at her tea table again and blushed. I know you'll think me dreadfully foolish, she said. I am foolish, and I'm ashamed of it when I'm found out, but never unless I am found out. I'm not expecting anybody. I was just pretending I was. You see, I was so lonely. I love company, that is, the right kind of company. But so few people ever come here because it's so far out of the way. Charlotta the Fourth was lonely too, so I just pretended I was going to have a tea party. I cooked for it and decorated the table for it and set it with my mother's wedding china, and I dressed up for it. Diana secretly thought Miss Lavender quite as peculiar as report had pictured her. The idea of a woman of 45 playing at having a tea party, just as if she were a little girl. But Anne of the Shining Eyes exclaimed joyfully, "Oh, do you imagine things too?" That, too, revealed a kindred spirit to Miss Lavender. "Yes, I do," she confessed boldly. "Of course, it's silly in anybody as old as I am. But what is the use of being an independent old maid if you can't be silly when you want to, and when it doesn't hurt anybody? A person must have some compensations. I don't believe I could live at a time if I didn't pretend things. I'm not often caught at it, though," said Charlotta the Fourth. "Never tells. But I'm glad to be caught today, for you have really come, and I have tea all ready for you. Will you go up to the spare room and take off your hats? It's the white door at the head of the stairs. I must run out to the kitchen and see that Charlotta the Fourth isn't letting the tea boil." Charlotta the Fourth is a very good girl, but she will let that tea boil. Miss Lavender tripped off to the kitchen on hospitable thought intense, and the girls found their way up to the spare room, an apartment as white as its door, lighted by the ivy-hung dormer window, and looking, as Anne said, like the place where happy dreams grew. "This is quite an adventure, isn't it?" said Diana. "And isn't Miss Lavender sweet if she is a little odd? She doesn't look a bit like an old maid." "She looks just as music sounds, I think," answered Anne. When they went down, Miss Lavender was carrying in the teapot, and behind her, looking vastly pleased, was Charlotta the Fourth, with a plate of hot biscuits. "Now you must tell me your name," said Miss Lavender. "I'm so glad you're young girls. I love young girls. It's so easy to pretend I'm a girl myself when I'm with them. I do hate," with a little grimace, "to believe I'm old. Now, who are you, just for convenience sake? Diana Barry? Anne Shirley? May I pretend that I've known you for 100 years and call you Anne and Diana right away?" "You may," the girls both said together. "Then let's just sit comfortably down and eat everything," said Miss Lavender happily. "Charlotta, you sit at the foot and help the chicken. It is so fortunate that I made the sponge cake and donuts. Of course, it was foolish to do it for imaginary guests. I know Charlotta the Fourth thought so, didn't you, Charlotta? But you'll see how well it has turned out. Of course, they wouldn't have been wasted, for Charlotta the Fourth and I could have eaten them through time. But sponge cake is not a thing that improves with time." That was a merry and memorable meal, and when it was all over, they went out to the garden, lying in the glamour of sunset. "I do think you have the loveliest place here," said Diana, looking round her admiringly. "Why do you call it Echo Lodge?" asked Anne. "Charlotta," said Miss Lavender, "go into the house and bring out the little tin horn that is hanging over the clock itself." Charlotta the Fourth skipped off and returned with the horn. "Blow it, Charlotta," commanded Miss Lavender. Charlotta accordingly blew a rather raucous, strident blast. There was a moment's stillness, and then from the woods over the river came a multitude of fairy echoes, sweet, elusive, silvery, as if all the horns of Elfland were blowing against the sunset. Anne and Diana exclaimed in delight. "Now laugh, Charlotta. Laugh loudly." Charlotta, who would have probably obeyed if Miss Lavender had told her to stand on her head, climbed upon the stone bench and laughed loud and heartily. Back came the echoes, as if a host of pixie people were mimicking her laughter in the purple woodlands and along the fir-fringed points. "People always admired my echoes very much," said Miss Lavender, as if the echoes were her personal property. "I love them myself. They are very good company, with a little pretending. On calm evenings, Charlotta the Fourth and I often sit out here and amuse ourselves with them. Charlotta, take back the horn and hang it carefully in its place. Why do you call her Charlotta the Fourth? Asked Diana, who was bursting with curiosity on this point. Just to keep her from getting mixed up with the other Charlottas in my thoughts, said Miss Lavendar seriously. They all look so much alike, there's no telling them apart. Her name isn't really Charlotta at all. It is, let me see, what is it? I think it's Lenora. Yes, it's Lenora. You see, it's in this way. When Mother died 10 years ago, I couldn't stay here alone, and I couldn't afford to pay the wages of a grown-up girl. So I got little Charlotta Bowman to come and stay with me for board and clothes. Her name really was Charlotta. She was Charlotte the First. She was just 13. She stayed with me until she was 16, and then she went away to Boston because she could do better there. Her sister came to stay with me then. Her name was Giulietta. Miss Bowman had a weakness for fancy names, I think. But she looked so like Charlotta that I kept calling her that all the time, and she didn't mind. So I just gave up trying to remember her right name. She was Charlotta the Second. And when she went away, Evelina came, and she was Charlotta the Third. Now I have Charlotta the Fourth. But when she is 16, she's 14 now, she'll want to go to Boston too. And what shall I do then? I really do not know. Charlotta the Fourth is the last of the Bowman girls, and the best. The other Charlottas always let me see that they thought it silly of me to pretend things, but Charlotta the Fourth never does. No matter what she may really think, I don't care what people think about me if they don't let me see it. Well, said Diana, looking regretfully at the setting sun, I suppose we must go if we want to get to Mr. Kimball's before dark. We've had a lovely time, Miss Lewis. Won't you come again to see me, pleaded Miss Lavendar. Tall Anne put her arm around the little lady. Indeed we shall, she promised. Now that we have discovered you, we'll wear out our welcome coming to see you. Yes, we must go. We must tear ourselves away, as Paul Irving says every time he comes to Green Gables. Paul Irving? There was a subtle change in Miss Lavendar's voice. Who is he? I didn't think there was anybody of that name in Avonlea. Anne felt vexed at her own heedlessness. She had forgotten about Miss Lavendar's old romance when Paul's name slipped out. He's a little pupil of mine, she explained slowly. He came from Boston last year to live with his grandmother, Miss Irving, on the Shore Road. Is he Stephen Irving's son? Miss Lavendar asked, bending over her namesake border so that her face was hidden. Yes. I'm going to give you girls a bunch of lavender apiece, said Miss Lavendar brightly, as if she had not heard the answer to her question. It's very sweet, don't you think? Mother always loved it. She planted these borders long ago. Father named me Lavendar because he was so fond of it. The very first time he saw Mother was when he visited her home in the East Grafton with his brother. He fell in love with her at first sight, and they put him in the spare room bed to sleep, and the sheets were scented with lavender, and he lay awake all night and thought of her. He always loved the scent of lavender after that, and that was why he gave me the name. Don't forget to come back soon, girl dears. We'll be looking for you, Charlotta the Fourth and I. She opened the gate under the figs for them to pass through. She looked suddenly old and tired. The glow and radiance had faded from her face. Her parting smile was as sweet with ineradicable youth as ever. But when the girls looked back from the first curve in the lane, they saw her sitting on the old stone bench under the silver poplar in the middle of the garden, with her head leaning wearily on her hand. She does look lonely, said Diana softly. We must come often to see her. I think her parents gave her the only right and fitting name that could possibly be given her, said Anne. If they had been so blind as to name her Elizabeth or Nellie or Muriel, she must have been called Lavendar just the same. I think. It's so suggestive of sweetness and old-fashioned graces and silk attire. Now my name just smacks off bread and butter, patchwork and chores. Oh, I don't think so, said Diana. Anne seems to me real stately and like a queen, but I'd like Karen Hoffa if it happened to be your name. I think people make their names nicely or ugly just by what they are themselves. I can't bear Josie or Gertie for names now, but before I knew the Pye girls, I thought them real pretty. That's a lovely idea, Diana, said Anne enthusiastically. Living so that you beautify your name, even if it wasn't beautiful to begin with. Making it stand in people's thoughts for something so lovely and pleasant that they never think of it by itself. Thank you, Diana. Well, thank you for joining me for these 2 chapters. I hope you've enjoyed this storybook adventure today, and I look forward to meeting with you here again next week. Same time, same place, here at the Joyful House. And until then, be joyful, my friends. Stay crafty in your own way. Make your own joyful creations. And above everything else, remember this: you are made of matter. Therefore, you matter. So go be your own exclamation. Mwah. Nugs and joy, everyone.